I never thought that at 72, I would still be waking up before dawn, as though I had a household full of children to feed or a company to manage. Old habits die hard, they say. For me, the habit was shaped by years of running a small but steady business with my late husband, a chain of convenience stores that kept our family afloat through the hardest decades. After his death, I swore I would guard what we had built, not just for myself, but for our son, Daniel. That morning, as the sun filtered weakly through my curtains, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of lukewarm coffee, staring at the steam as though it could tell me something about the future. My house felt too big, too quiet, the walls echoing with memories. I had lived in this home for over 30 years. Every creak of the floor, every chip in the paint carried some story of my life. Yet lately, those stories had begun to feel like fragile paper in a storm, easily torn away. Daniel had been visiting more often in recent months. At first, I thought it was affection. After all, he rarely came before unless he needed something fixed or money for some temporary situation. Now he appeared on my doorstep with his wife, Viola, in tow. Viola was a woman I had never fully trusted, too polished, too smug, always looking around my house as though calculating its worth. She smiled with her lips, but never with her eyes. "Mother," Daniel said one evening, standing in my living room with his hands shoved into his pockets, "you shouldn't worry about all those papers and accounts anymore. At your age, you should rest. Let me take care of everything." It was meant to sound like care, but something in his tone unsettled me. He was 38, tall like his father, but with none of his patience. Viola sat beside him on the sofa, nodding sweetly, her manicured nails gleaming. "Yes, Grace," she added. She always called me by my first name, never Mom. "You deserve peace. Daniel knows how to handle money better. You won't have to trouble yourself." I forced a smile, hiding my unease. "I've been handling money for more than 50 years, Viola. I think I can manage." They exchanged a glance, quick but sharp, like two actors who had forgotten their line. Then Daniel leaned closer. "You'll see, Mother. It's better this way." That night, after they left, I sat at my desk and went through my papers again. Bank statements, store contracts, deeds, everything was in order, or so I thought. I didn't know then that behind those gentle words and practiced smiles, my own son had already begun forging a trap around me. A trap that would soon strangle every ounce of peace I had left. The next morning came with heavy skies, clouds pressing low as if the world itself carried a secret I wasn't meant to know. I pulled my cardigan close and went about my small routines, watering the violets on the windowsill, feeding the stray cat that had made my porch her home, folding the laundry that always seemed to multiply despite my living alone. Simple tasks, the kind that gave me a sense of order in a life that, unbeknownst to me, was beginning to spin out of control. Daniel called around noon. His voice was unusually cheerful, which always meant one thing. He wanted something. "Mother," he said, his words rolling quickly, "Viola and I were just talking about you. We really think it's time you stopped worrying about all those complicated finances. It's not healthy at your age. Why don't you let me help? Just sign a few papers and I'll manage things. You can enjoy your golden years without stress." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. "Daniel, I told you yesterday, I don't need help managing what I already know. Your father and I built this business. Every dollar in it was earned with long nights and tired hands. I'm not handing it over like it's nothing." Silence, then a sigh. "You don't trust me, do you?" I closed my eyes. Trust. That word used to mean something between us. I remembered the boy who clung to my skirts when thunder scared him, the teenager who brought me wilted daisies from the roadside because he knew I loved flowers. But now his voice carried no warmth, only impatience. "Daniel," I said softly, "I want to trust you, But money changes people. I've seen it. I have to be careful. He muttered something under his breath. I thought I caught the word stubborn. Viola's voice floated in the background, muffled but sharp, like a knife being sharpened on stone. That evening they came again. Viola wore a silk blouse the color of wine, expensive no doubt. She walked through my house as though she owned it already, trailing her manicured fingers along the banister. Daniel followed, carrying a leather folder. "Mother," he began, sitting at the dining table, "these are just simple authorizations, nothing dramatic. With your signature, I can take care of tax filings, renewals, bills. You don't want to spend your days buried in paperwork." I narrowed my eyes at the folder. "Show me." He hesitated, then slid the papers toward me. I adjusted my glasses and began to read. The language was dense, legalistic, but one phrase stood out: power of attorney. My stomach tightened. I looked up at him. "Daniel, do you think I'm blind? This isn't about paying bills. This would give you full control of my accounts, my property, everything." Viola gave a soft laugh, tilting her head. "Grace, really, don't make it sound so sinister. It's just practical. Everyone does it at your age. We're only thinking of your safety." My safety? My voice trembled, though not from fear, from anger. Or your convenience. Daniel slammed his hand lightly against the table. "Why do you always assume the worst of me? I'm your son. Do you think I'd hurt you?" I looked at him long and hard. His jaw was tight, his eyes darting toward Viola, as though searching for approval. She sat perfectly still, her painted lips curled into a faint, victorious smile. Finally, I pushed the folder back across the table. "No, Daniel, I won't sign. Not today, not tomorrow." The air grew thick. Viola's smile faltered. Daniel clenched his teeth, then stood abruptly, gathering the papers with a sharp snap. "If that's how you feel," he said, voice low, "then don't expect me to keep offering." As they walked out, I stood at the window, watching their car pull away. The sky had turned nearly black, and a storm was brewing. Lightning split the horizon, followed by a growl of thunder. I felt it in my bones. A storm was coming from me, too, not just from the sky, but from within my own family. That night, I lay awake listening to the rain batter the windows, the house groaning against the wind. A thought settled into me like a stone at the bottom of a well. My own son was planning something that could ruin me if I wasn't careful. And for the first time in my life, I felt afraid of Daniel. I woke up restless, long before the sun rose. The storm from the night before had left the ground soaked, and the air in my bedroom smelled of wet earth drifting in through the slightly opened window. The world outside was still gray, the kind of morning where silence feels heavy, as if everything is holding its breath. I padded into the kitchen and brewed coffee, letting the rich aroma steady me. My house was quiet, too quiet. Ever since Richard passed, the mornings had stretched into long corridors of solitude. Yet that morning, solitude felt different. It felt like warning. I set my mug on the table, opened the little drawer where I kept my important papers, bank statements, utility bills, insurance receipts. I always liked order, neat piles, dates written carefully in my own handwriting. But when I pulled the folder out, something was off. The latest bank statement wasn't there. I remembered seeing it just 2 days ago. I could picture the white envelope with the blue logo. My stomach tightened. I shuffled through the papers twice, then a third time, my hands trembling. It was gone. I told myself maybe I had misplaced it, maybe tucked it into the wrong folder. But the truth pressed down on me like the thick gray clouds outside. Someone had taken it. I thought back to yesterday, to Daniel sitting at this very table, Viola's perfume still lingering in the air after she left. He had handled the papers. He'd slid them across the table with practiced ease, trying to trick me into signing away everything. And while I read those legal words, while I argued, could he have slipped something out? By mid-morning, my unease had grown too loud to ignore. I wrapped a scarf around my shoulders and walked to the post office, a habit I had kept for years. The young clerk, a polite girl with freckles, handed me the small stack of mail. Bills, advertisements, and then another envelope from the bank. I opened it right there, my fingers stiff. The numbers stared back at me, merciless. Withdrawals I didn't make. Thousands gone, spread across different dates. My breath caught. My knees went weak, and I had to grip the counter. "Are you all right, Mrs. Holloway?" the clerk asked, concern flickering across her face. "Yes," I forced a smile, folding the paper quickly. "Just a little dizzy. The weather, maybe." I walked home in a daze, the cold wind cutting at my cheeks. Every step echoed in my head. He's already started. My own son. When I got back, I sat down in the parlor, staring at the fireplace that hadn't been lit in months. I thought of Richard again, his careful hands, his steady way with numbers. He would never have believed this of Daniel. Neither would I, not once. We had raised him to be honest, to work hard, to respect what was earned. Where had all that gone? I didn't have long to sit with my thoughts. The phone rang. It was Daniel. "Mother," he said briskly, "I need to come by this afternoon. There's paperwork you forgot to sign. We can't keep delaying this." I gripped the receiver tighter. "Daniel, I found my bank statement. There are withdrawals I didn't authorize. Do you know anything about this?" The silence on the line was sharp, telling. Then his voice shifted, softer, as though coating poison with sugar. "Mother, you're confused. Maybe you forgot. You've been stressed. That's why I keep saying, you need me to handle these things. You can't keep track the way you used to." My chest burned. Don't you dare talk to me like I'm senile. I know what I've done and what I haven't, and I haven't taken out $10,000 in cash. He exhaled loudly, irritation breaking through. "Stop making this harder than it has to be. I'm trying to protect you. Viola and I have plans, and they include you. You can either come along willingly or what?" My voice rose despite the lump in my throat. He didn't answer. He hung up. I sat frozen, the dial tone humming in my ear. My hands trembled so badly I could hardly place the receiver back. That night, I couldn't eat. I couldn't even read, though I tried to open my book of poems, something I usually turn to for comfort. Every word blurred. The house, usually my haven, suddenly felt like a cage. I locked every door and window, even though Daniel still had his own set of keys somewhere. As I crawled into bed, I whispered aloud, as though speaking to Richard in the dark. "They're coming for me, Richard. Our son. Our own son." The tears came then, hot and bitter. I cried until sleep finally pulled me under. But sleep offered no peace. I dreamed of ink bleeding across contracts, of Viola's red lips curling into a smile as the walls of my home crumbled around me. And when I woke before dawn, heart pounding, I knew one thing for certain. I had to be ready, because Daniel was not going to stop. The day Daniel invited me to dinner at his mansion, the air carried a damp chill. The sky was painted a pale silver, heavy with clouds that threatened rain. But I still put on my best wool coat. I told myself I had to see them on their ground, not just wait in my own home while they made plans in secret. As I drove up the long driveway, lined with manicured hedges, I couldn't help but notice how extravagantly the house gleamed. Viola had insisted on this place. I'd heard her gushing about it before. Vaulted ceilings, marble counters, chandeliers shipped from Italy. All of it sat there smugly, a monument to my son's money. Or rather, to mine. I parked my old sedan near the massive stone steps and walked up slowly, cane in hand, though I didn't really need it. Sometimes I used it to remind myself that I was allowed to look fragile. Fragility made people underestimate you. The door opened before I even knocked. Viola stood there, glowing in a silk dress the color of wine, her blonde hair swept up, diamonds sparkling at her ears. Her smile was thin and sharp, like a knife waiting to cut. "Grace," she said, voice dripping with exaggerated warmth. "What a lovely surprise. Daniel didn't tell me you were coming." "He invited me," I replied flatly, brushing past her perfume cloud as I stepped inside. The foyer was grander than I remembered, polished marble underfoot, a sweeping staircase curving like a serpent above me. Viola closed the door and walked beside me, her heels clicking with calculated rhythm. "You know," she said lightly, "it's time you let go of that drafty old house of yours. It must be exhausting keeping it up. Here, with us, you'd be taken care of, don't you think?" I turned my head, catching her gaze. "I'm not an invalid, Viola. I don't need to be taken care of. What I need is honesty, something in short supply around here." Her smile faltered, but only for a second. "Oh, Grace, always so suspicious." We entered the dining room. Daniel sat at the head of the table, a crystal glass of wine in his hand. He stood when he saw me, trying on a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mother," he said smoothly, "I'm glad you came. Sit, please." The table was set as though for royalty, silver candlesticks, fine china, plates of food that looked plucked straight from a magazine. Viola slid into her seat beside him, touching his arm with a familiarity that always made me uneasy, as though she owned him entirely. I sat opposite, folding my hands in my lap. My coffee-colored coat looked out of place against the glittering table, but I didn't care. I had come for truth, not spectacle. Daniel cleared his throat. "Mother, we need to discuss the paperwork again. You can't keep delaying. The longer you hold off, the more complicated things get. The loans." I cut him off, my voice firmer than I expected. "The loans I never agreed to. The ones you took in my name. The ones that have left me owing nearly $10 million. His face flickered, a flash of shock, then anger, then a quick mask of calm. Viola's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Mother," he said carefully, "you must be mistaken. You don't understand how these things work. The banks wouldn't give that kind of money without your consent." I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. And yet they did. With your help, with forged signatures. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Viola's lips parted, and she laughed softly, though it didn't sound amused. "Grace, really, you've been watching too many crime dramas. No one here is forging anything. You must be confused." I slammed my hand on the table, startling even myself. The glasses rattled. "Stop calling me confused. I may be 72, but my mind is sharp. I know what I signed, and I know what I didn't. Don't you dare make me out to be a fool." Daniel's face hardened. "You're tired, Mother. All this responsibility, it's too much for you. Viola and I can handle it. We just need your cooperation." "Cooperation?" I spat the word like poison. "You mean surrender. You want to strip me of everything I've built, everything your father and I worked for. You've already taken the money. What's next? My home? My freedom?" Daniel exchanged a quick glance with Viola, one of those silent conversations couples think no one notices. Viola smirked, leaning back in her chair. "Maybe guardianship would be best," she said casually, as if discussing the weather. My blood ran cold. There it was, spoken aloud. "You dare," I whispered, my voice shaking with fury, "to suggest taking away my independence, locking me under your control like some prisoner?" Daniel's voice grew sharp. "Mother, you leave us no choice. Either you trust us to take care of matters, or the courts will. Do you really want to drag your name through all that mess?" The candles flickered between us, shadows dancing across their faces. And in that moment, I saw them both clearly. Not family, not blood. Predators. Smiling predators dressed in silk and charm. I rose slowly, pushing back my chair. My knees wobbled, but my spine held straight. "I will not be your victim.
Not now, not ever. I turned, walking toward the door without another word. My footsteps echoed through their glittering palace, each one heavier than the last. When I reached my car, I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The rain finally broke, lashing against the windshield as though the sky itself shared my rage. And as I drove away from their mansion, one thought burned in my mind like fire. If they wanted war, then war they would have.
The rain did not stop that night. It drummed against the roof of my house, steady and merciless, as though the world itself was warning me that a storm much greater than weather had already begun. I sat by the window in my old armchair, a wool blanket wrapped around my shoulders, staring into the blur of water and streetlights. I thought of Daniel's face at the dinner table, that cool, deliberate calm he had learned from me, twisted now into something dangerous. And Viola's smirk, her diamond earrings catching the candlelight as if mocking me. My son and his wife, plotting to strip me of my life as though I were nothing more than an obstacle in their climb toward power. The word guardianship clung to me like a poison. I had seen what it meant for others, old friends, acquaintances, women from church. Once the courts declared you unfit, everything slipped from your hands. Your home, your finances, even your medical decisions. You became a name on papers shuffled by strangers. That night, I made myself a promise. I would never let Daniel sign me away into silence. The next morning, the rain had slowed to a fine mist. I brewed coffee, stronger than usual, and sat at the kitchen table with a pen and notebook. My hand trembled as I wrote, but the words flowed all the same. Step 1. Find a lawyer, a good one, someone who doesn't bow to the likes of Daniel. I tapped the pen against the page, staring at the words. Money would be an issue. The loans Daniel had taken meant the banks viewed me as drowning in debt. But I still had some assets, things hidden away, things he didn't know about. I would use them if I had to. By mid-afternoon, I had pulled on my coat and gone into town. The air was damp and cold, the kind of weather that made my joints ache, but I moved with purpose. I passed by familiar storefronts, the bakery that once displayed my husband's favorite cherry pies, the antique shop where I'd sold trinkets in harder years. At the corner, I paused in front of a lawyer's office. The brass letters on the door read, Harris and Cole, Attorneys at Law. Inside, the office smelled of old books and lemon polish. The receptionist, a young woman with tired eyes, asked if I had an appointment. I shook my head. I need help, I told her. Family has taken advantage. I've been left with debts I didn't make. Perhaps it was the desperation in my voice, or perhaps she recognized the kind of betrayal only family could inflict. But she told me to wait. 10 minutes later, a man in his 40s stepped out. Tall, clean-shaven, with a face that looked like it had seen too much already. Mrs. Callahan, he asked, I'm James Harris. Why don't you come into my office? I followed him down a hallway into a room lined with shelves and framed certificates. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. Now, he said gently, tell me everything. And so I did. I told him about Daniel, about Viola, about the loans and the forged papers. I confessed my fear of guardianship, the shadow of losing everything I had built. My voice cracked at times, but I never let it falter completely. James listened, pen scratching notes, his brow furrowed deeper with every detail. When I finished, silence hung heavy. He tapped his pen against the desk before speaking. Mrs. Callahan, if what you're saying is true, and from the way you've described it, I believe you, then your son has committed fraud on a massive scale. Forgery, misappropriation, possibly even elder financial abuse. These are not small matters. My stomach twisted. Hearing the words out loud made it all the more real. So what can I do? I whispered. His eyes met mine, steady and firm. You fight, but you must be careful. He will deny everything. People like your son, people who feel entitled, they don't crumble easily. You'll need proof, documents, witnesses, anything that ties him directly to those loans. Do you have access to his records? Not yet, I admitted, but I can find them. He always underestimates me, always thinks I'm weaker than I am. A small smile tugged at James's lips. Then use that. Let him think you're frail, confused, easy to manipulate, while in truth, you'll be gathering the rope he's already wrapped around his own neck. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of strength returning. James continued, I'll help you, but this won't be fast, and it won't be clean. Are you ready for that? I looked out the window at the mist, at the gray clouds shifting like restless spirits. My voice was steady when I answered. I've been through storms before, Mr. Harris, and I've survived every one of them. I'll survive this, too. But my son will learn that betrayal comes with a price. As I left his office, the mist had lifted. The pavement still glistened with rain, but the sky was beginning to break, streaks of pale blue cutting through the gray. I tightened my coat and walked with firmer steps than I had in years. The war had begun, and this time, I wasn't walking into it blind. The following days unfolded in a haze of routine, but beneath it ran a current of dread. I watered my plants, folded laundry, swept the front porch, all the small rituals of an ordinary life, but each action was only a mask. Behind it, my mind worked endlessly, calculating, remembering, planning. Daniel had always assumed I lived in a fog of old age, moving slow, blind to detail. He was wrong. I saw more than he realized, and I remembered things. Little things. His careless words, the accounts he used to brag about, the way Viola spoke too loudly when she thought no one was listening. James Harris had told me I needed proof, and proof meant stepping into dangerous territory. On Tuesday, I dressed with unusual care. Gray slacks, my best wool coat, hair pulled into a neat bun. I wanted to look respectable, not frail. At the bank, I asked to see the manager, Mr. Carr. He had known me for years, though not well. His eyebrows lifted when I requested copies of every loan attached to my name. It's quite a lot, Mrs. Callahan, he said carefully. I know, I answered, my voice steady, and I'll need them all, every signature, every document. He hesitated, perhaps torn between policy and pity. Finally, he nodded. Give me a few days. When I left the bank, I stood on the sidewalk breathing in the crisp winter air. My knees ached, but I felt taller somehow. That stack of papers would be the first weapon in my hands. That evening, I busied myself in the kitchen, chopping carrots for a stew. The radio hummed low with old music. Then, around 8, headlights swept across my driveway. My heart sank. Daniel. He came in without knocking, as if he already owned the place. Viola followed, fur draped around her shoulders, perfume filling the air like an invasive weed. Mother, Daniel said, all false warmth, we thought we'd check in, see how you're managing. I forced a smile, though my chest tightened. Managing fine, dinner's on the stove. Viola wrinkled her nose at the smell. Stew again, she murmured to Daniel, loud enough for me to hear. They settled into the living room, speaking in low voices. I stayed near the kitchen, half hidden, pretending to stir the pot while straining my ears. Once the guardianship goes through, Viola said, her tone sharp, we can finally stop babysitting this mess. The bank is breathing down our necks. 10 million, Daniel. Do you even grasp that? I grasp it, he snapped. That's why we need her declared incompetent. Once I'm in charge, we can liquidate assets, shift debts, move forward. She'll be none the wiser. My hand gripped the wooden spoon so tightly it nearly cracked. None the wiser. That was what he thought of me, a fool, a burden. Viola's voice lowered, but I still caught the words. And the house, the land, that's worth a fortune. Imagine what we could do once it's ours. A silence followed, heavy with greed. I turned back to the pot, stirring furiously to mask the tremor in my hands. When they left an hour later, with Viola complaining about the chill in the air, I sat alone at the table.
My stew had gone cold, untouched. The rage burning in my chest was hotter than any fire. James had been right. Daniel would deny everything. But now I had heard their plan with my own ears. Guardianship, liquidation, selling off the very walls that had sheltered me through decades of storms. I pulled out my notebook again, the same one where I had written Step 1. With firm strokes, I wrote, Step 2, record everything. Every word, every visit. The clock ticked on, steady, patient, like it had all the time in the world. But I didn't. Daniel was moving fast. I would have to move faster. As I turned out the lights and climbed the stairs to bed, I whispered to myself, they think I'm weak. They've forgotten who raised them. They've forgotten what I'm capable of. And for the first time in a long while, I almost smiled.
The week crawled forward with the kind of heaviness that presses on the chest. The weather had turned bitter. The sky carried a steel-gray tint, and the wind scraped dry leaves against the porch steps. Winter was creeping in, and with it, a feeling that time was running short. I woke early every morning, often before dawn, my mind restless. I would sit by the window with a cup of coffee, steam fogging the glass, watching the quiet street outside. The silence was deceptive. My own life was anything but still. I had written Step 2, record everything, in my notebook, and now it was time to act. A recorder wasn't hard to find, a small digital device I ordered quietly, paying cash so no trace would circle back. When it arrived, I tucked it into the side drawer of my desk, my fingers brushing over it as though it were a loaded weapon. The first test came sooner than I expected. Daniel called late on Thursday evening. "Mother, we're coming by tomorrow," he said. His tone was brisk, clipped, as if the conversation was just another item on his schedule. "We'll need you to sign some paperwork, nothing complicated, just standard bank things." My breath caught, but I forced my voice into calm. "I'll be here." When I hung up, I pressed my palms flat against the table, steadying myself. Paperwork, standard bank things. I knew what that meant. More lies, more traps. My son had become a stranger I could not trust. The next day, when their car pulled into the driveway, I had already prepared. The recorder was hidden on the mantel, angled perfectly to catch every word spoken in the living room. Daniel carried a folder under his arm, thick with papers. Viola followed, her heels clicking across the hardwood floor, her perfume leaving an oily sweetness in the air. "Mother," Daniel said, forcing a smile, "you're looking well." "I do my best," I replied, gesturing for them to sit. My hands trembled only slightly as I poured tea. Daniel laid the folder on the table, sliding a few pages toward me. "These just need your signature, routine. They'll help streamline some of the debts and protect your interests." My eyes scanned the lines, though I knew better than to trust what I saw. Legal language twisted like vines across the page. Words like transfer, consolidate, authorization jumped out at me. "What does this mean, Daniel?" I asked quietly. "It means you won't have to worry," he answered, almost too quickly. "I'll handle the hard parts. That's what sons are for." Viola laughed, low and sharp. "Yes, Grace, you're lucky, really. So many mothers your age are alone, helpless. At least Daniel is willing to step in." Helpless! The word stabbed. I kept my face still, though my stomach churned. "I'll think about it," I said, sliding the papers back across the table. Daniel's jaw tightened. "There's nothing to think about. The longer you wait, the worse this gets. The bank doesn't sit still, Mother." I repeated, firmer this time, "I'll think about it." The silence that followed was thick, heavy enough to press against the walls. Viola leaned back, crossing her legs, smirking. Daniel gathered the papers, his movements sharp, controlled. "Fine," he said, standing. "But don't say I didn't try to help you. When this all collapses, remember it was your choice."
They left in a storm of perfume and irritation. I stood in the middle of my living room, my heart hammering. For a long moment, I simply listened to the clock ticking on the wall, steady and indifferent. Then, with trembling fingers, I retrieved the recorder. I pressed play, and their voices filled the room. Every word captured, every lie preserved. I sank into a chair, relief washing over me, proof. It wasn't much yet, but it was something. My son thought he had cornered me, but he had just walked into my trap. Later that night, I bundled myself in a shawl and stepped out onto the porch. The air was sharp, cutting into my lungs, but the stars above glittered cold and steady. I wrapped the shawl tighter around me and whispered into the dark, "You will not take me down, not this way." The trees swayed, the wind rustled through their branches, and I felt something stir inside me, a quiet, dangerous determination. I was not helpless. I was not finished.
The next morning dawned heavy with fog. It pressed low across the yard, swallowing the fences and muffling the distant hum of traffic. I sat at the kitchen table with the pen in hand, the recorder lying next to me like a silent confidant. The words from last night still echoed in my head. Daniel's sharp tone, Viola's smirk, the word helpless like a brand on my skin. I could have stayed paralyzed by fear. That was what they wanted, wasn't it? For me to curl up quietly, to trust that my son knew best, to hand over everything I had worked for. But no, that time was gone. I slipped the recorder into my purse, tucked the bank statements I'd been collecting into a folder, and called a cab. I didn't want Daniel or Viola to notice my car moving. The driver was a quiet man with a kind face who asked no questions as I gave him the address of a lawyer downtown, a different one from before, one Daniel wouldn't expect. The law office was on the 12th floor of a glass building, its windows swallowed in fog so that it seemed to float above the city. My steps echoed in the hallway as I entered, my heart beating fast but steady. The lawyer's name was Mr. Saunders, an older man, perhaps in his late 60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes. He shook my hand firmly and gestured for me to sit. "What brings you to me, Mrs. Whitaker?" he asked, folding his hands on the desk. I slid the folder across to him. "My son," I said quietly, "and his wife. They've put me in a hole so deep I can hardly see daylight. $10 million in debt. Loans I never asked for. Papers I never understood. And now they want me to sign over more." His eyes narrowed as he opened the folder, flipping through the statements. His brows rose higher with every page. "10 million," he muttered. "This isn't simple mismanagement. This is fraud." "Yes," I whispered. "And I have this." I set the recorder on his desk, pressing play. Daniel's voice spilled into the office. "There's nothing to think about. The longer you wait, the worse this gets. The bank doesn't sit still, Mother." And then Viola's venomous laugh, her words dripping with disdain. "At least Daniel is willing to step in." When the recording ended, the room was heavy with silence. Mr. Saunders leaned back, steepling his fingers. "This is more than negligence. It's coercion. If they've forged documents, if they've taken out loans in your name without your consent," he paused, studying me. "We can build a case, but you must be careful. They will fight back." "I've been careful all my life," I said, my voice shaking but strong. "And where has it left me? Used, betrayed, alone. No more." His eyes softened. "Then we'll begin, slowly, quietly, step by step. By the time they realize what's happening, we'll have everything we need." I nodded, relief loosening something in my chest. For the first time in months, I felt like I wasn't drowning alone. When I returned home that afternoon, the fog had lifted and the sky was pale blue. Yet peace didn't last long. Daniel's car was already in my driveway. My stomach dropped. I stepped out of the cab, clutching my purse tightly, as Daniel stormed down the porch steps toward me. "Where were you?" he demanded. His voice was sharp, suspicious. I lifted my chin. "Out."
Out where? That's none of your concern. His eyes narrowed, searching my face, as if trying to dig out the truth by force. Viola appeared in the doorway, her silk blouse glowing in the afternoon light, her mouth twisted into that familiar mocking smile. "Daniel, don't badger her," she said sweetly. "She probably just went to the grocery store. You know how these things tire her out." I walked past him, shoulders stiff, and unlocked the door. "If you two are here to bully me again," I said coldly, "you can turn around and leave." Daniel followed me inside, his voice rising. "Don't play games with me, Mother. You're hiding something." "I don't know what you mean," I replied, forcing my tone into calm. "You didn't answer your phone all morning. Don't think I won't notice when you're sneaking around." I turned then, facing him fully, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the boy he once was. The child who used to run home from school, his hair tousled, his pockets full of marbles. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man whose greed had hollowed him out. "I don't owe you explanations," I said. My voice was low but steady, and it surprised even me. "I am not your puppet, Daniel." His jaw tightened, his nostrils flared. Viola laughed again, that brittle sound that grated against my bones. "Careful, Grace," she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "You don't want to make him angry. He's the only one standing between you and complete ruin." I looked at her then, really looked. Her diamond earrings glistened, her nails gleamed with fresh polish, her blouse was silk. All of it, I thought bitterly, bought with my name, my credit, my future. The anger that rose in me was hot and sharp, but I swallowed it. Not yet. Not here. Instead, I smiled faintly and said, "We'll see." That night, after they left, I sat at my desk with the recorder again. My hands no longer trembled when I turned it over in my palms. Every word they spoke, every slip of arrogance, I would gather it all. The tide was turning. They just didn't know it yet.
The following days moved like shadows, quiet on the surface, but heavy underneath. I went through the motions of my routine, tending to the garden, cooking myself small meals, writing in my journal late into the night. But all the while, my thoughts circled back to Daniel and Viola, the lies, the debts, the humiliation. I began to notice things I had ignored before. Envelopes tucked carelessly into drawers, official stamps on letters that never made sense to me, Daniel's hasty explanations that I had accepted too easily. One morning, as I was sorting through the pile of mail left on my hall table, I found a thick envelope addressed to me, but already opened. My heart began to thud in my chest as I pulled out the papers inside. It was a notice from the court. Guardianship hearing. Petition filed by none other than my son, Daniel Whitaker. For a moment, the letters swam before my eyes. Guardianship. As if I were some senile old woman incapable of making her own decisions. As if I weren't the one who had raised him, paid for his education, built the foundation of his life with my own two hands. The petition was meticulous. My alleged forgetfulness, my inability to manage finances, my declining mental health. Lies, all of them. Each word cut deeper than the last. At the bottom of the document, his signature sprawled confidently, next to the neat scrawl of Viola's as a witness. I sat there, frozen, until the sound of my grandfather clock striking noon jolted me back into myself. My hand trembled as I reached for the phone. I dialed Daniel's number, and he answered after the third ring, his voice casual, almost cheerful. "Mother," he said, "I was just about to call you." My throat was dry. "What is this, Daniel?" I hissed, holding the papers up as though he could see them through the line. "What's what?" "Guardianship," I spat. "A petition to the court. You think you can strip me of my rights, my freedom, my dignity?" There was a pause. Then he sighed, as though I were an unruly child. "Mother, please, this is for your own good. You've been making terrible financial decisions. You're overwhelmed. Viola and I just want to protect you." "Protect me?" My voice cracked with fury. "You bled me dry. You forged my name. And now you want to call me incapable?
You want the world to think I've lost my mind?" I heard the faint clink of ice in a glass on his end, the casualness of it nearly making me scream. "You're being dramatic. This way, the debts will be handled more responsibly. It's not personal." "Not personal?" My hand tightened on the receiver until my knuckles whitened. "You're trying to erase me from my own life." A soft laugh floated through the line, Viola's voice, silky and cruel. "Oh, Grace, it's already done. The hearing is in 3 weeks. You really ought to rest. Stress isn't good for a woman your age." I slammed the phone down so hard the wood beneath it rattled. My chest heaved, hot tears spilling down my cheeks, not of weakness, but of rage. I stumbled into my bedroom and yanked open the drawer where I kept old files. Birth certificates, the deed to the house, my medical records. I spread them across the bed, comparing signatures, scrutinizing details. And there it was, tucked neatly between insurance forms, a loan agreement for $3 million, with my name scrawled across the bottom. But it wasn't my hand. I traced the letters with a finger, cold washing over me. Daniel, my son, the boy I had once taught to write his name by candlelight at the kitchen table, his little tongue poking from the corner of his mouth in concentration. Now he had twisted that same hand to steal from me, to bury me. I pressed the papers to my chest and sank onto the bed. Outside, the late afternoon sun slipped behind clouds, casting the room in a dim, gray hush. My whole body trembled, but inside me, something hardened. A core of steel I hadn't known was still there. They thought I was helpless. They thought I was old, tired, blind. But they had forgotten who I was. I would not let them write me off like an expired check. Not yet, not ever. That night, I called Mr. Saunders again. My voice was steadier than I expected as I told him everything: the guardianship papers, the forged signature, the loan. "Bring them to me tomorrow," he said. His voice was calm but urgent. "We need to prepare. This is bigger than debt now. They are trying to erase you, Mrs. Whitaker, but they've made mistakes, and mistakes leave trails." I hung up the phone and looked out the window. The fog had returned, thick and suffocating, but for the first time, I didn't fear it. Somewhere in that darkness, I knew a fire was burning, and it was mine.
Sleep abandoned me that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint groan of the old house as if it were breathing with me, restless and unsettled. Each creak of the floorboards sounded like an accusation. Betrayal ran through my veins like poison, keeping me awake, yet sharpening me at the same time. By dawn, my decision was clear. I would no longer carry this alone. Silence had allowed Daniel and Viola to spin their web unchecked. If I stayed quiet now, they would strangle me in it. I dressed slowly, choosing a wool coat though the weather was mild. My hands needed something firm to cling to. As I buttoned it, I looked at myself in the mirror. The face staring back at me was lined, weary, framed by graying curls. But the eyes, oh, the eyes had not dulled. They gleamed with a determination I had nearly forgotten. I tucked the forged loan papers and the guardianship petition into my handbag, then made my way to the small cafe at the edge of town where I had promised to meet Mr. Saunders. The morning air smelled faintly of rain, the sky streaked with low, gray clouds. The sidewalks were slick, puddles catching dim reflections of street lamps not yet turned off. Inside the cafe, warmth and the smell of coffee enveloped me. Mr. Saunders was already there, seated at a corner table with his briefcase resting beside him. He rose politely when he saw me, pulling out a chair. "You look tired, Mrs. Whitaker," he said softly as I sat. "I haven't had the luxury of sleep," I replied, forcing my voice steady. "Not since I realized my own son wants to erase me." He gave a solemn nod, then opened his briefcase. "Show me what you brought."
With hands that no longer trembled, I laid the papers out on the table. The waitress hovered nearby, curious, but I gave her a look that sent her scurrying away. Saunders adjusted his glasses, his brow furrowing as he examined each document. "This," he muttered, tapping the loan agreement, "is amateur forgery, sloppy. Notice the inconsistency in the loops of the K and R compared to your actual signature. If he thinks this will stand up in court, he's more reckless than I thought." Reckless? That word almost made me smile. For all his arrogance, Daniel had always believed himself cleverer than anyone else. Perhaps his hubris would be my salvation. "There's more," I said. "Neighbors, friends, people who've seen the packages arriving at their mansion, people who know the truth. I kept quiet because I thought it was my burden to bear. But now," I shook my head. "No more silence." Saunders leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Do you trust anyone enough to testify?" I hesitated. The word trust had become fragile in my heart. But one name came to mind immediately: Margaret Holloway, my neighbor of 30 years. She had watched Daniel grow up, had baked him cookies when he was a boy, had whispered her concerns to me in recent months about the extravagance of his life compared to mine. "She's seen everything," I said. "She knows the kind of woman Viola is. If anyone can speak, it's Margaret." "Good," Saunders said. "Gather her and anyone else willing to stand by you. This isn't only about defending yourself from guardianship. It's about dismantling the story they've created. The court needs to see the truth, not the lies they've painted." I nodded, my chest tightening. A flicker of hope stirred, delicate as a flame cupped in my hands. When I left the cafe, the rain had begun to fall. Not a storm, but a steady, cleansing drizzle. The town streets glistened. As I walked home, umbrella clutched tightly, I felt the water on my cheeks, mingling with tears I no longer tried to hide. That afternoon, I went to Margaret's house. She opened the door before I could knock twice, her kind eyes widening when she saw me. "Grace, dear, what on earth?" I stepped inside without waiting, my coat dripping onto her rug. "Margaret, I need you. I need your eyes, your words, your truth." Over steaming cups of tea, I unfolded the story: the loans, the forged documents, the guardianship petition. She gasped, covered her mouth, shook her head in disbelief. "I knew they were selfish," she said finally, "but this, Grace, this is monstrous. You won't face it alone. I'll tell anyone what I've seen: the trucks delivering furniture, the parties they've thrown, the jewelry Viola bragged about while you pinched pennies." Her loyalty wrapped around me like a blanket. I reached for her hand, gripping it tightly. "Thank you," I whispered, my throat thick. By evening, we had already made a list of others: the mailman who had complained about the endless parcels, the gardener who tended their sprawling new lawn, the housekeeper they had let go when she asked too many questions. For the first time in months, I did not feel like a woman teetering on the edge of ruin. I felt like a force quietly gathering strength. As I walked back home under the clearing sky, I lifted my face to the last drops of rain. The clouds were parting, streaks of pink and gold piercing through. A thought settled over me, steady and certain. They thought they had silenced me. They thought old age made me weak. But they had forgotten: storms never last forever. And when they pass, the air is sharper, the sky clearer, and the earth stronger for having endured.
The house was quiet when I returned, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the living room floor. I set down my umbrella, still damp, and let my coat slip from my shoulders. The familiar creak of the stairs sounded unusually loud, almost accusatory, as if the house itself sensed the storm brewing inside me. Daniel and Viola arrived shortly after, stepping into the room with their usual air of entitlement. Viola's heels clicked sharply against the hardwood, each tap a small insult I felt in my chest. Daniel carried the same folder he had tried to shove in front of me days before, as if the papers alone could intimidate me. "Mother," he began, his voice smooth, calculated, "we need to talk." I stood, pressing my palms flat against the table. Yes, we do. Viola's laugh, low and cold, punctuated the space between us. Oh, this should be entertaining. Grace, you've been very quiet lately. I almost forgot you could speak. My eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. I can speak, and I intend to be heard. Daniel set the folder on the table, sliding it toward me. These documents will make everything easier. The guardianship, the loan adjustments. Do you think I am blind? I interrupted, my voice rising just enough to crack the air. Do you think I cannot see what you've done? Forged signatures, loans in my name, trying to make me invisible? You have crossed every line imaginable, and I will not be silent anymore. Viola's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing. Grace, that's enough dramatics. You're overreacting. We're only trying to help you manage. Manage? I echoed, my voice shaking with a fury that had been simmering for months. You call this managing? Stealing from me? Trying to hand me over to a court-appointed stranger? Spending my money like it was your own to waste? Daniel shifted, visibly uncomfortable. Mother, that's not fair. Not fair? I laughed, bitter and raw. Do you know the meaning of fairness, Daniel? You have lived off my labor, my savings, my trust. You parade your success while I shoulder the consequences of your greed. Viola crossed her arms, her composure faltering. You're impossible. No one will take your side. I leaned forward, my hands flat on the table, locking eyes with her. You are wrong. Someone will. People have seen your games, your lies, and I will show them. I will not be silenced or erased. The tension in the room was thick to choke on. Daniel's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Viola's face was pale, her perfect composure cracking with fear. Not of me personally, but of exposure, the one thing neither of them could tolerate. I have evidence, I said, reaching into my bag and pulling out the recorder. Every lie, every scheme, every word you thought you whispered behind my back. I placed it on the table between us. The recorder was small, inconspicuous, but its presence was enough to command attention. Daniel glanced at Viola, their silent communication tense, almost frantic. You wouldn't dare, Daniel said finally, though his voice lacked the certainty he usually carried. Oh, I would, I replied, calmly, almost too calmly. Because the truth will come out, whether you like it or not, and when it does, you will answer for every bit of deceit. Viola's lips pressed together in a thin line. And what, Grace? You think anyone will believe you? I leaned back, letting the weight of my words hang in the air. I don't need them to believe me yet. I have time, and patience, and the truth. And that, I said, gesturing at the recorder, is more powerful than your wealth or your cunning. They remained silent, caught between anger and fear, while I felt a sense of calm settle over me. For the first time in months, I was not trembling, not pleading, not hiding. I was standing firmly in the center of my own story, ready to reclaim it piece by piece. The sun slipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow that spilled across the room, painting their faces in shadow. I watched them, noting the subtle tension in Daniel's shoulders, the twitch in Viola's fingers. They had underestimated me. They had counted on my silence. They would soon learn that the quietest storms can be the most devastating. And I was no longer quiet. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain from the night before. I walked through the garden, my hands brushing over the damp leaves, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease just enough to think clearly. Every flower, every droplet of water on the petals reminded me of the life I had cultivated, the life that Daniel and Viola had tried to steal with their greed and lies. I returned inside and opened my ledger, a carefully kept record of every penny I had spent over the past years. The debts, the mysterious withdrawals, the loans,
Every detail was a thread, and now I needed to follow each one to unravel their tangled web. Margaret had agreed to help, and together we began tracing the money. It was meticulous work, requiring patience and attention to detail. For weeks, we pored over bank statements, receipts, and emails, documenting each transaction Viola and Daniel had made. There were extravagant jewelry purchases, luxury cars, and, most tellingly, a massive deposit into a real estate account that neither of them could explain. "They've bought a mansion," Margaret said one evening, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Look at this. It's registered under Viola's name, entirely from your accounts, Grace." I felt a cold fury rise in me, but I held it in check. Anger alone would not win this battle. Strategy would, planning, evidence, patience. "I see it," I said quietly, tracing the numbers with my finger. "They've thought they could erase me, but they've left footprints, and we're going to follow every one of them." The following week, I began making discreet calls. Former employees of Viola's small business ventures, delivery men, accountants, anyone who had handled money on her behalf. Some were hesitant, afraid of retaliation, but when I explained that I was gathering the truth and that their testimony could protect them from future trouble, they began to open up. Each piece of information, every reluctant admission, became another weapon in my arsenal. Meanwhile, Daniel continued to hover, unaware that I had begun assembling the pieces. He called almost daily, checking in with feigned concern, pressing me to consider the guardianship and avoid stress. I answered politely, always careful not to reveal the full scope of my investigation. One afternoon, as I reviewed a set of bank statements, I noticed a series of transfers that had been cleverly hidden, slightly smaller amounts sent repeatedly over months to Viola's new mansion account. The realization made my hands shake with excitement and rage. They had thought themselves untouchable, building their luxurious life on my name, my money, my trust. I called Mr. Saunders immediately, his voice calm and steady on the line. "I have them," I said. "Every transaction, the mansion, the jewelry, the cars, all documented." "Excellent," he replied. "This is what we needed. Now we prepare for the legal groundwork, guardianship, fraudulent loans, embezzlement. The court will see the full picture." Days passed in a tense rhythm. I spent hours at the computer, creating folders, organizing evidence, writing notes. Margaret came by frequently, her presence a steady reminder that I was not alone. We laughed occasionally, sharing memories of Daniel as a boy, marveling at how greed had twisted him. Those moments of levity kept me grounded, kept me from the despair that could have easily swallowed me. Then one evening, a letter arrived in a plain white envelope. The postmark was from the local courthouse. My hands trembled as I tore it open. Inside was a notification. A hearing date had been set, not for the guardianship Daniel had attempted, but for a preliminary review of financial irregularities. I read the notice twice, my breath catching with excitement. The law was finally catching up to them, and I was ready. Every hidden transfer, every forged signature, every act of deceit would be revealed. Daniel and Viola had underestimated me. They had assumed I was weak, silent, compliant. They had forgotten that truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it is buried. I looked out the window at the city skyline, the lights beginning to twinkle as dusk fell. A sense of calm determination settled over me. Soon, very soon, they would see the woman they had tried to destroy. Not weak, not helpless, but vigilant, prepared, and unyielding. The first wave of justice was coming, and I would be the one to deliver it. The day of the meeting arrived with a gray, overcast sky, the kind that presses down on the shoulders and makes the city streets glisten as if reflecting the turmoil inside me. I had dressed carefully, choosing a navy coat that was simple yet dignified, and wore my gloves even indoors,
a small act of control in a world that had been spiraling out of my hands. Daniel and Viola were already waiting at the entrance to my home when I stepped outside. Their faces were carefully composed, but I noticed the subtle tension in Daniel's jaw and the rigid line of Viola's posture. They had been expecting meekness, a trembling mother cow to be led by the nose, and instead I was calm, deliberate, and fully aware of the power I now held. "Mother," Daniel began, forcing a cordial tone, "we need to discuss—" "You need to discuss nothing," I cut him off, my voice steady, carrying over the sound of the rain tapping on the pavement. "I am fully aware of everything you've done. Loans, forged signatures, spending my money without consent, and I will not sit quietly while you pretend this is normal." Viola's eyes narrowed. "Grace, you don't understand. Everything we've done is for your benefit." I laughed, sharp and bitter. "For my benefit? You've drained my accounts, bought yourself luxuries I will never enjoy, and even tried to hand me over to a court-appointed guardian. You think that is benefit?" Daniel opened his mouth, but I raised a hand to stop him. "No, I want to hear nothing. I have already spoken to my lawyer. Every move you've made, every deceitful act, is documented, and you will answer for it." Viola's composure wavered, her lips pressed into a thin line, and I could see the calculation in her eyes. They had thought they could manipulate me, intimidate me, and they had been caught off guard. "You can't prove anything," Daniel said finally, his voice tighter than usual, betraying his anger and fear. "Oh, but I can," I said calmly, reaching into my bag and placing a thick folder on the hood of my car. Bank statements, receipts, witness statements, records of forged signatures. Everything. And there is more than enough evidence for the authorities and the courts to take notice. Viola's hand twitched toward her purse, a futile gesture, and I shook my head. "Stop pretending you are untouchable. Your mansion, your cars, the accounts you funded with my money, all of it is under scrutiny. And the law does not favor thieves, no matter how cleverly they hide behind family ties." Daniel took a step closer, his face red. "Mother, you are being ridiculous. You think you can intimidate us with threats and documents? You have no idea the connections we have, the people we can call on." I met his gaze steadily. "Connections? I have connections too. People who have seen your actions, who are willing to testify. And most importantly, I have the truth on my side. You have only lies, carefully crafted, but lies are fragile. One crack and everything collapses." For a moment, silence fell. The rain fell harder, drumming on the car and the pavement, filling the pause with a sense of inevitability. I could see Daniel's mind working, Viola biting her lip, their combined confidence beginning to crumble. "You will regret this," Daniel said finally, a low growl in his voice. "You are making a huge mistake, Mother." I smiled, not sweetly, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had endured betrayal and found a way forward. "The only mistake I made," I said, "was trusting you. Everything else, the rest, is mine to reclaim." As I walked past them toward my front door, the rain soaking the hem of my coat, I felt a sense of liberation that I hadn't felt in months. They had tried to trap me in fear and submission, but I was no longer afraid. Every meeting, every conversation, every piece of evidence I had gathered had strengthened me. I had begun to take my story back. Inside, I laid out the evidence neatly on the dining table, categorizing each document, labeling each transaction, each forged signature. Margaret arrived later, bringing with her a calm energy that steadied my own. Together, we planned the next moves, notifying the authorities, preparing for the court hearings, and setting traps to ensure that Daniel and Viola could not manipulate the situation again. That night, as I stood by the window watching the rain turn to mist, I felt a surge of determination. They had stolen my money, tried to erase me, and humiliated me.
But now the balance was shifting. The storm they had unleashed was about to turn, and when it did, they would find themselves powerless against the truth. I had waited too long to act, but the waiting had sharpened me, and soon, very soon, the day of reckoning would arrive. The courthouse smelled of polished wood, damp coats, and the faint tang of coffee that seeped from the corner cafe. I stepped inside with a confidence I had not felt in years. Each echo of my heels on the marble floor felt like a drumbeat announcing the beginning of the end. Not the end of my life, but the end of their power over me. Daniel and Viola were there, sitting stiffly in the front row, their usual smugness muted, replaced by apprehension they could not hide. I met their eyes briefly. Viola's cheeks were pale, Daniel's jaw taut. I knew then that they were beginning to understand that I was no longer the passive, trusting mother they had tried to manipulate. My lawyer, Mr. Saunders, whispered a few last words of reassurance. "All your evidence is solid. They've underestimated you, Grace. Today, they will see that the law favors truth." I nodded, letting the tension in my shoulders settle into something purposeful. When it was our turn, we stepped into the courtroom. The light from the high windows illuminated the dust motes in the air, casting the room in a golden haze. I could feel every eye on me, every expectation hanging like a curtain of invisible weight. The judge listened patiently as Mr. Saunders laid out the case: forged loans, fraudulent signatures, unauthorized spending, and the attempt to place me under guardianship. Each document, each witness, each recorded phone call was presented with precision. Margaret and other witnesses gave statements, their voices steady, unwavering. Daniel's attempts to interrupt or contradict were met with polite but firm reproof from the judge. Viola fidgeted, twisting her ring nervously, her carefully maintained composure crumbling under the weight of exposure. As I watched them squirm, a quiet satisfaction grew in me. This was not about revenge through cruelty or malice, but about justice. Their arrogance, their belief that they could manipulate me with impunity, was unraveling before my eyes. When the judge asked me to speak, I rose. The room was silent. Even Daniel and Viola's whisper stopped. "Your Honor," I began, my voice calm but firm, carrying the weight of every betrayal I had endured. "I have spent a lifetime building a life, earning trust, and planning for the years I believed I could live in peace. My own son and daughter-in-law chose to betray me, to steal from me, and to attempt to erase me from my own life. I am here to ensure that truth is recognized and that justice is served, not only for myself, but as a warning that deceit within a family has consequences." The courtroom remained quiet, the gravity of my words sinking in. I felt a strange release, a lightness I had not experienced in months. I had taken the first step toward reclaiming everything they had taken, and I had done it without raising my voice or allowing fear to dominate me. The verdict, when it came, days later, was resounding. The court reversed the fraudulent loans, ordered Daniel and Viola to repay every penny they had misappropriated, and nullified the guardianship attempt. Viola's newly purchased mansion was placed under lien until the debts were covered. Daniel's financial maneuverings were scrutinized, his credit and reputation severely damaged. As I walked out of the courthouse, sunlight spilling over the steps and warming my face, a sense of triumph settled over me. I had taken control of my story. I had faced betrayal, humiliation, and greed, and I had emerged not only unbroken but victorious. That evening, I sat in my living room, a cup of tea warming my hands, and finally allowed myself to breathe fully. The house was quiet, the rain had stopped, and the garden smelled faintly of damp earth and flowers. I had won, not through anger or vengeance, but through patience, persistence, and a refusal to be erased. For the first time in many months, I felt truly free. And I knew that from this moment onward, no one would ever underestimate me again. The morning after the court's decision, the sun rose pale and gentle, spilling light across the living room in soft gold slashes.
I sat by the window, tea steaming between my hands, and for the first time in months, the house felt entirely mine again. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the old trees outside seemed to echo a quiet triumph. I had fought, I had endured, and the balance had finally begun to tip in my favor. Yet the victory in court was only part of the story. Daniel and Viola were still present, lurking like shadows in the corners of my life, trying to maintain their image of control even as the truth had toppled their schemes. I could feel them calculating, whispering to one another, attempting to determine their next move. Their desperation was almost palpable, and I could not help but savor it, though carefully, without gloating, for patience had been my ally for months. I decided it was time to assert not just my financial security, but my presence, my dignity, and my authority in a way that left no room for further manipulation. I arranged a small gathering, ostensibly to celebrate the resolution of the court case. Margaret, my loyal friend, helped me send invitations to a few trusted neighbors, former colleagues, and people who had been witnesses to the years of manipulation and deceit. When Daniel and Viola arrived, expecting a meek acknowledgement, they were met with smiles, polite conversation, and a room full of eyes that recognized the truth. Viola's lips pressed into a thin line, and Daniel's posture stiffened, a forced calm masking panic. They could not speak without drawing attention to the contrast between their arrogance and my regained strength. Margaret leaned close as I poured tea. "They thought this would intimidate you, Grace," she whispered. "Look at them now." I smiled, quietly. "They underestimated the patience of a woman who has been betrayed, Margaret. They forgot that silence does not equal submission." The afternoon passed in measured conversation, the chatter of neighbors and friends filling the spaces that Daniel and Viola had once tried to dominate. I let them speak, nodding politely, occasionally interjecting with a calm, precise correction when they misrepresented events. Each correction, each subtle reminder of their misdeeds, drew attention without needing to raise my voice. Later, I excused myself and walked through the garden. The air smelled of wet earth, and the faint hum of bees among the flowers reminded me that life, despite treachery, continued. I realized then that revenge was not only about reclaiming money or exposing lies. It was about reclaiming my narrative, the life that had been nearly stolen from me. That evening, I received a call from my lawyer. "Grace, the liens on Viola's mansion have been enforced. Any attempts to sell or refinance will now trigger automatic alerts. They are effectively trapped in the consequences of their own choices." A calm satisfaction settled over me. The court had delivered justice, but now, quietly and efficiently, the repercussions were taking shape outside its walls. Daniel and Viola's arrogance had become their undoing, and I would ensure it continued without me needing to raise a hand further. I prepared dinner that night, the kitchen warm and fragrant with roasted vegetables and fresh bread. As I set the table, I reflected on how far I had come, from a mother betrayed and nearly silenced to a woman who had reclaimed her story with patience, strategy, and unwavering courage. I would not allow fear or manipulation to rule me again. And as the evening light faded, I made a quiet promise to myself. Every step forward from here would be deliberate, every decision a reinforcement of my strength, and every encounter with those who had wronged me would carry the weight of truth, exposure, and justice. I had begun the next chapter of my life, one in which Grace, finally, was fully, undeniably in control. The morning air carried a crispness that felt almost celebratory, as if the world itself acknowledged the long battle that had finally reached its resolution. I stood by the window, overlooking the garden where the dew sparkled like tiny diamonds on the leaves, and allowed myself a deep, unhurried breath. The house was quiet, calm, and entirely mine. For the first time in what felt like decades, I could enjoy the sensation of stability, of control restored. Daniel and Viola had tried every trick they knew: forged documents, secret loans, manipulation, and intimidation. They had believed that my age, my patience, or my apparent compliance would render me powerless. But in their hubris, they had forgotten one crucial fact. I knew my worth, my story, and I would not allow them to rewrite either. The court had returned my finances, nullifying every loan they had taken out in my name. Viola's mansion was now a sealed liability, their assets frozen until restitution was complete. I had even ensured that local authorities were aware of every fraudulent action, creating a network of accountability that left them trapped in the consequences of their own greed. That afternoon, I received unexpected visitors. Former colleagues, neighbors, and even distant family members who had watched the drama unfold from the sidelines came to offer congratulations, a quiet chorus of support that warmed the house with life. I greeted each one with calm dignity, sharing tea and laughter in measured doses, each smile a silent message to Daniel and Viola. Their schemes could not erase my presence nor my respect. Margaret, ever my confidant, leaned over as Viola and Daniel arrived, summoned for the final settlement discussions. They had been forced to meet me face to face in my restored home, stripped of the arrogance and intimidation they had once wielded like weapons. Viola's heels clicked sharply against the floor, but her eyes avoided mine, darting nervously to every supportive face around me. Daniel's usual polished demeanor faltered, the tension in his shoulders and jaw betraying his panic. "Mother," Daniel began, his tone careful, too polite, "we want to—" "You have nothing left to offer but excuses," I interrupted calmly. "Everything you have done, every lie and every attempt to manipulate me is already on record. Your apologies mean nothing without restitution, and even that will take time to correct." Viola's lips trembled as she muttered something under her breath, but I did not need to hear it. I had already won. Every attempt to intimidate or deceive me had been neutralized. The law, my careful planning, and my unwavering patience had dismantled their power. The settlement was final. Every dollar stolen was returned. The mansion, the cars, the accounts, all under scrutiny and control, ensuring they could no longer exploit or manipulate. I watched them sign the final papers, their expressions pale and defeated. The arrogance that had carried them so far was gone, replaced by the stark reality of accountability. As the papers were filed, I felt a lightness I had not known in years. The house seemed to breathe with me, the sun spilling golden warmth across the room, illuminating the familiar furniture, the photographs, and the memories that were truly mine. I walked through each room, touching surfaces, breathing deeply, and savoring the tangible reality of my restored life. That evening, as twilight fell, I sat by the fireplace with a cup of tea, Margaret beside me. The house was filled with quiet contentment, a far cry from the tension and fear of months past. I reflected on the journey, the betrayal, the manipulation, the attempts to erase me. Each act of treachery had strengthened my resolve, sharpened my strategy, and deepened my understanding of my own resilience. For Daniel and Viola, life would never be the same. The consequences of their greed, arrogance, and betrayal would follow them relentlessly, a reminder that no deceit against those who know their own worth could go unpunished. For me, life had opened a new chapter, one of freedom, dignity, and control. I had reclaimed not only my finances, but my peace, my authority, and my story. Sitting there, watching the firelight dance across the walls, I felt a profound sense of triumph and quiet joy. I had endured betrayal, faced the brink of loss, and emerged victorious, stronger than I had ever imagined possible. Grace was no longer a passive figure in her own life. She was the architect of her destiny, the keeper of her story, and the quiet, unstoppable force that had turned betrayal into empowerment. And in that moment, as the house settled around me and the night deepened outside, I finally allowed myself to smile,
not with relief, not with anger, but with a satisfaction that comes from knowing justice, patience, and truth had prevailed. Her story, my real story, had been reclaimed, and I would never let it be stolen again.